We've looked at 8 individuals thus far in our series from Hebrews chapter 11 that we've titled By Faith. We've talked about Abel and Enoch and Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And it just so happens that all of those come from the book of Genesis. But Joseph is the last that is in Genesis, and then we move on from Genesis on into the book of Exodus as we're reading in our Old Testaments. And remember, while Joseph was there in Egypt and in power, the family of Jacob moved down to the land of Goshen and things went well with them. They even remained after the famine was over and no doubt continued to prosper. But then trouble was on its way. After Joseph died, we're told in the Exodus text that there arose a king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And what he saw was that the people of Israel were growing and they were becoming mighty, and this didn't sit well with him, and so he dealt shrewdly with them and he made them slaves for himself. Despite being afflicted by the Egyptians and being in slavery, the Hebrews continued to grow and to prosper, which shouldn't surprise us. That's what we saw with Joseph in his life. That's how God deals with those who are his, and so things continued to go well, and so eventually it was decided that they needed to take more aggressive action, and so that's when the Pharaoh ordered the killing of all male children who were born to the Israelites. And that's the setting in which Moses was born. And so as we continue, again, we're using Hebrews 11 as our text to focus on these people of faith. In verse 23, we find this: by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. Now, you might be looking at that picture and think, well, hang on, that's not Moses. You might also be looking at that and thinking, hang on, that's not Moses' parents. And you're right. I want to focus on 2 people who are not specifically mentioned in the text by the Hebrew writer, but who most certainly had great faith in God. Back in Exodus 1 and at verse 15, we're told their names. Their names are Shiphrah and Puah. They are the Hebrew midwives. In Exodus 1 verse 16, we're told Pharaoh commanded them, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. That is what they were commanded to do. When you go and do your work among the Hebrews, you are responsible to kill all the male children. So Pharaoh's not going to go deal with that on his own. And he thought, what better place to take care of this than right at birth? And so these Hebrew midwives were charged by Pharaoh to do this. In verse 17 of Exodus chapter 1, we're told this: the midwives feared God. What a great statement. The midwives feared God. They have been commanded by Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, here's what you're going to do. The midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. They feared God, not Pharaoh, and so they obeyed God, not Pharaoh. In our lesson today, all 3 individuals, or 2 of them are groups, but in every case what we have is somebody who is commanded by authority to do a certain thing which is contrary to the will of God. And each case we have individuals who have enough faith in God to stand up and do what's right. And that's the challenge for us. Sometimes we may be commanded by those who are in authority to do things that we don't like. So what? If we don't like it and it doesn't violate God's will, do it. But if we're commanded by those who are in authority to do something that is contrary to the will of God, then we need to be like Shiphrah and Puah and stand up and do what God says because we fear God. Pharaoh wanted to know why they were disobeying his commandments. See, he wasn't just letting this slide by, and so he called them back into his presence. In Exodus chapter 1 and verse 19, they explained to him what was going on. This is what they said: the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Now, Revelation 21 and at verse 8, we find there that God does not condone or bless lying. All liars have their part in the lake of fire which burns with fire and brimstone. God does not condone or bless lying. And so let me suggest to you that when they say this, they are not lying to Pharaoh. I don't know all that was going on. What I'm left to conclude is that God was somehow affecting the birthing cycle of the Hebrew women, and they were giving birth before the midwives were going to show up. And so rather than destroy the child's already out of the birth canal, the child's already in the swaddling clothes and so forth. I'm not going to do that. And so God made it so that they were not there. Now, I wonder if they were there for the birth of many of the girls and not for the boys. But whatever it was, they're not lying about what's going on here. Exodus 1 verse 20, God dealt well with the midwives. They glorified him in their actions. He dealt well with them. We have no idea how many Hebrew baby boys ended up in the Nile River dead. There were a lot of them. We do know that many were saved because Shiphrah and Puah feared God and respected life. And oh, that our society would have that same kind of respect for life. That the respect these fine women had for life would permeate our society. Do you realize that an average of 100,000 children are cast into the river each year in Canada? Are aborted? 100,000 on average every year. Worldwide, that number turns into 42 million abortions every year. How many great lives have been lost through that? You know, how many exceptional leaders and skilled artists and godly people have been lost through that? And so how wonderful that the Hebrew writer, he mentions when he was born. That when he was born does not happen without Shiphrah and Puah, without these two Hebrew midwives. They and their faith. How wonderful that these two Hebrew midwives in Egypt stood for life and for godliness. And oh, that people today would do the same. Again, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. So let's move on and talk about his parents for a little bit here. The Lord and the Hebrew midwives were responsible for Moses being born without any harm, but after his birth, now his safety lies in his parents' hands. And so for 3 months, they have hidden him from the Egyptians. Now, understand, I don't believe this is going to be an easy thing for them to do. It may be that soldiers have been checking houses for newborn boys. If they knew that a woman was with child and they've not seen her for a while, they may track down where she lives and find out, was it a girl, was it a boy, let me see the baby. Both men and women were working as slaves. It's not as though, okay, well, we're going to send the men out, the men are going to work, and the women, they don't have to work, they're not slaves. They were all slaves. And so Moses' mother would still be going out to work. You know, this whole idea of maternity leave, you know, that's a very modern idea. That's not something that Moses' mother was going to get. There's no maternity leave. And I would imagine that you would see the Hebrew women out in the fields and cutting the hay and so forth that would be used in order to make the bricks and such, and they may have their children wrapped up and either on their back or hanging in front of them or wherever it be. And so Moses' mother is out there doing the same thing, but she has a boy, not a girl. And she has to hide this from the taskmasters. They're not afraid of Pharaoh or of his people. Keeping him hidden those 3 months had to be incredibly difficult. And it seems that after 3 months they realized we can't keep doing this. Eventually he's going to be discovered, and when he is discovered, whether we're talking about a newborn baby or a 4-month-old, I don't think that the Egyptian soldier really cares. The command is all Hebrew male children die. And so the likelihood he would be found would be increasing day by day. And so Moses writes about his own mother in Exodus chapter 2. And here's what he writes about her. He says in verse 3, when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. His mother, her name, by the way, is Jochebed, she was willing to give up her son. Now, we might look at this and think, well, hang on, how's that going to work? Stick him in a basket and stick the basket on the river, and how's that going to work? May I suggest to you that God likely had a plan here. I don't know if God had spoke to her or if she had spoke to God and prayed that God would take care of this child. I don't know which way or if both ways there was communication. But I don't think this is an act of desperation. As we follow the Exodus text, we find that Miriam, his older sister, is following her baby brother as he floated along the river. She's on the shore and she's keeping an eye on him. She's making sure that he's okay. And the placement of this basket in the water could not have been in a better place, because it floats into the sight of Pharaoh's daughter. If God had not established this plan, at the very least, it is a case of God's providential care. There's no one better to find this child. She has compassion for him, and she chooses to save him from the fate that her father had determined for him and for all the Hebrew boys. And not only is his life saved, but he ends up being returned back to his mother with protection. Do you remember Miriam comes to Pharaoh's daughter and asks, do you want me to go find one of the Hebrew women so that she can nurse him? Pharaoh's daughter can't nurse him. She needs somebody else to take care of that. And so he goes back to Jochebed and to her care. And so she set her baby boy into a basket, trusting that God would care for him. And indeed he did, and he brought him right back to her. This time without the fear. Remember, she couldn't hide him anymore, and I need to do something, and this is what she did. And now she could raise him, and in fact has the protection of those Egyptian soldiers. They're no longer searching to destroy this child. The kind of faith that she showed is the same kind of faith that we saw in Abraham. Remember, God tells Abraham, go to a mountain of which I will tell you, and there you will sacrifice your son, your only son, Isaac. And he goes out and he's ready to sacrifice his son, trusting that God is going to work things out. And whether Abraham understood how that was going to work or not, we're not told. I suspect that he didn't understand the fullness of it. The Hebrew writer does tell us he reasoned that God is going to raise him up from the dead. Jochebed exercised the same kind of faith. sending her son out on the river. And then she's granted the opportunity to raise her son until the time that he's weaned. And again, without fear of the Egyptian soldiers. Verse 24 through 26. It now focuses on Moses himself. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. So Moses stayed with his parents until he was weaned. And we don't know how old he was when that happened. You do some reading of the time of weaning among people in ages of antiquity, and you can get a variety of different ages. Today, typically, age 2 is about where children are going to be weaned, sometimes even earlier than that, but not so in those days. Some children, it would be about age 5. I have read sources that indicate that some would go even as far as age 12, which in our mind just sounds baffling that would be the case. But let me tell you why this is important. She's not just feeding him. She's not just clothing him. She's teaching him. And so whatever it is, whether it's age 5 or 6 or 7 or 9 or 10 or whatever age it was when he was finally weaned, he had several years of being taught who he is, who his people are, who God is. And so when he finally does go to Pharaoh's daughter and he will stay there, he understands he's a Hebrew. And he knows about the God of creation. Jochebed, and let me mention also Amram, that's his father's name, they did their job. They raised this child to know God. And that's important because it would come back as we will see. So by faith, we're told now in our text, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. I don't know how long he mulled over his hereditary or his ethnicity and his origin as a Hebrew. We're not told, but at the age of 40 is when he finally took action. In Acts chapter 7 and verse 23, it says that when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. He had been raised to be an Egyptian. We are told that he was trained in all the wisdom of Egypt. Now we might wonder, well, why? What's the point of training him in all the wisdom of Egypt? Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews, in Book 2, he writes about Moses, and Josephus indicates he was actually being groomed to be the next king of Egypt. That is why this was so important to Pharaoh's daughter, and that is why this young Hebrew boy is being trained in all the wisdom, being told all the things about Egypt. The reigning Pharaoh had no sons. He had a daughter. He had no sons. His daughter was without child until Moses came. That would set him next in line to be king. How embarrassing then for Pharaoh that Moses chose this feeble race of slaves over the power and the glory that was offered to him as a grandson of the Pharaoh. Who does that kind of thing, right? I can choose between the muck and the slime over here, or I can be over here in a palace. I can choose to be with a bunch of slaves who all they do is work for somebody else every day, or I can choose to be the one they work for. Who chooses to go over to that side? Well, Paul stated it this way in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. He said that we need to walk by faith, not by sight. That's exactly what Moses was doing. His decision to turn away from the Egyptian upbringing and to go to the Hebrews was based not in sight. If that was the case, it looks a lot better over on that side. The plush life of a king rather than the plight of a slave. He looked beyond that. And that's what we see at the end of the text. He looked to the reward. He looked to what was beyond. He was going to have affliction and reproach. That's what he chose. Choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. The writer talks about four things here that were all within his grasp, that he could choose. He could have the passing pleasures of sin. He chose not to have that. All four things here are temporal. But understand, if he chose the passing pleasures of sin, there's an eternal component. The penalty for sin is eternal. He could have had the treasures. He esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. You remember what Solomon tells us about treasures? They will take up wings and fly away. Do you know what happened to rich Egypt within one generation? It became among the poorest nations in the world. And so he chose affliction and reproach, which worked for him a far greater reward. He looked to the reward. He looked beyond the temporal. He looked to the eternal. And you know, let's just be as direct as we can about this. If there is nothing after the grave, then sin and riches was the right choice. But there is something after the grave. If all we are individuals who live in this life and then it's all over, then live for self. But that's not what life is about. There is something after the grave. There is either heaven or hell. There is eternity. And Moses understood. And we need to understand that there is something more, that we are here preparing ourselves for there, wherever there's going to be for us. The Apostle Paul, he talked about this same kind of trade-off. He faced it as well, just like Moses did. But here's how he worded it, Romans chapter 8 and at verse 19. I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Could go and choose to do all kinds of things, but Paul chose to suffer for the Lord, and he said, that's okay, because heaven is so much greater. 2 Corinthians 4 and at verse 17, he wrote very much the same thing. He says, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment. Think about that. You know what Paul writes several chapters later, right? He lists off all those things that he had endured, and I don't think he gave us a complete list. I think there's more to it. But he says, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Moses looked to the reward. Paul looked to the reward. We need to look to the reward. Finally, verse 27. In verse 27, we're told, by faith Moses forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. The word forsook here, strong word, to leave down, to leave behind, to abandon. Moses abandoned Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Do you realize that he actually forsook Egypt twice? not just once. He did it twice. The first time was in Exodus chapter 2 and at verse 15. He went alone to preserve his own life from the king. Remember, the king wanted to kill Moses because Moses had rose up and had killed one of the Egyptian soldiers who was harming a Hebrew slave. And so Moses fled from Egypt. He forsook Egypt. That time there might have been some fear. I don't think that's what the Hebrew writer's talking about. He spends 40 years away from Egypt. He gets married. He has children. He's a shepherd. And he's comfortable. And then one day while he's out with his father-in-law's sheep, he sees a tree that's on fire. And yet it's not burned. And he goes to investigate. And he's called by God to go back to Egypt. He doesn't want to go. You know, in Exodus 3 and 4, the back and forth between Moses and God, he keeps on coming up with reasons why he's not the right guy to go. And God keeps answering those reasons. And so finally, Moses just simply says, send somebody else. I don't want to go. And that's when the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. You shall go to Egypt, and you shall speak to Pharaoh, and you shall lead my people out. And so he goes. By faith, Moses forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. That's talking about the second time that he's in Egypt, when he leads the Hebrews away from bondage. The first time was self-preservation. The second time was doing God's will to save God's people. And he did not fear the wrath of the king. Before Moses led away the people out of Egypt, he was threatened by Pharaoh. Exodus 10 at verse 28, Pharaoh says this to him, get away from me. Take heed to yourself and see my face no more. Don't you ever come back in my presence again. For in the day that you see my face, you shall die. Pharaoh said, I'm going to kill you if you ever show up here again. He was threatened by the most powerful man in the world at that time. That is not an overstatement. There was no one in that day and age more powerful than Pharaoh in Egypt. But Moses wasn't moved by Pharaoh's threat. He didn't cower. He didn't shy away. We're going to accomplish God's will. And so he trusted that regardless what Pharaoh might plan to do, God is going to accomplish his will. Moses endured as seeing him who is invisible. You know, the apostles had a similar experience. Their foe was nowhere near as powerful as Pharaoh, but still a powerful foe. The Jewish council in both Acts 4 and Acts 5. In Acts 4, Peter and John were arrested and commanded not to speak in the name of Jesus anymore. They weren't silenced. Verse 19 and 20, this is what they said in return. Whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you more than God, you judge. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. We've got to obey what God said. And then listen to their prayer to God later on. Verse 29 and 30 of Acts chapter 4. Lord, look on their threats and grant to your servants that with all boldness we may speak your word, by stretching out your hand to heal, and that signs and wonders may be done through the name of your holy servant Jesus. Lord, we want to keep on serving you, and don't let us be moved by fear. Give us the boldness we need. In Acts chapter 5, all the apostles were arrested, not just two. All of the apostles were arrested, put in prison by the high priest and the council. Remember, God sent the angel in the middle of the night, opened up the doors, and they were told, go back out to the temple square and preach. And so there they are the next morning, and they're preaching, and to an indignant high priest, the apostles said this: we ought to obey God rather than men. Friends, we need to have that kind of faith. The Hebrew midwives disobeyed the command of Pharaoh because they needed to obey God. Moses' parents disobeyed the command of Pharaoh because they needed to obey God. Moses himself disobeyed the command of Pharaoh because he needed to obey God. There are times when we may need to disobey the command of Pharaoh because the right thing is to obey the command of God. May we have that kind of faith, to trust in God that He will do good and that He will reward faith, and that choosing His will first and foremost is our calling and what we need to do, even if that sets us against an earthly authority. I'm not saying go and disobey earthly authorities for the sake of disobeying earthly authorities. God's word tells us in Romans 13, obey the earthly authorities. The governing authorities that are given. He says they're appointed by God. And yet there are the occasions that will happen at times and in places where they command people to do what's contrary to the will of God. And when that happens to us, who do we obey? We obey God. We need to understand the importance of obedience to God, regardless of what the circumstances are, and regardless of what the consequences are. That could have worked out very badly for the Hebrew midwives. Could have worked out very badly for Moses' parents. Could have worked out very badly for Moses. They did not take the consequences into account. And so may we have that kind of faith, that we will stand and that we will obey God no matter what the circumstances are. May we walk by faith. We can help you in your walk today. We want to do that. Maybe we can be praying for you, or maybe there's something we need to sit down and study in order to help one another in the walk of faith. However we can help, let's be a help to each other. We want to encourage one another and build each other up and prepare each other, prepare ourselves for when the Lord comes, or for the time of our death, whichever it is that comes first. We want to be ready for that time so that we will have eternity in heaven. That's the goal. So let's work towards that. If we can help you in any way, let us know as we stand together and sing.